What's up guys, it's Eric from Rare Candy, and today I'm going to be going over my North American Internationals Championship tournament report for you guys. So recently the North American Internationals tournament was held, and it's actually I believe the largest tournament ever in the history of the game. There's about 2,000 players there and right under 1,400 I believe in the Masters division. So basically double the size of the regionals that we've typically had throughout the season. So definitely a absolutely gigantic tournament. And I actually personally had a lot riding on this one. I'm somewhat close to getting my invite. I needed to day two this tournament in order to finish getting enough championship points to go to Worlds. So I had a lot riding on this event, and so definitely a very important event for that reason too. So yeah, I guess going into this regionals, the most notable new thing that has happened in the game is that Guardians Rising has become legal. So you know, a lot has happened since the Sun and Moon format, that is for sure. And one thing I actually really enjoyed about this tournament is that we've had a couple of other regional tournaments happen recently as well. So I think people had kind of figured out the format. It's become kind of solidified at this point, which I actually really enjoy because it makes picking a deck a lot easier. So I think most people have an idea of what the best decks are, and I think that allows for people to make some interesting deck choices and potentially try to metagame the tournament and pick out something that can beat the field. So yeah, I was really excited about that. And I guess leading up to this tournament, a couple of decks I had my eye on were going to be Drampa Zoroark and Mega Rayquaza. Drampa Zoroark I think has kind of emerged to be the best deck in the format, debatably. And I even took it to a first place finish at a League Cup recently as well, which we did record. I'll be sure to put a link to that if you want to see that video series. But yeah, so I think that's a big deck people had their eye on, and that was expected to do very well. So I was definitely testing with that and really enjoying that. But Mega Rayquaza was another deck I was very heavily favoring. I've had some success with it this past season. And also, you know, people are not really playing Sudowoodo, so I think that allows Mega Rayquaza to potentially sneak into this metagame and do well. So at the beginning of the Guardians Rising format, I think a lot of people were putting Sudowoodo in their lists. It was a very popular tech, I think, for Seattle regionals and even Madison as well, but not so much for, you know, ever since really. So that was the reason I had my eye on Mega Rayquaza, and other than its Zoroark matchup, I think it had great matchups, generally speaking. So, you know, I was basically planning on playing one of those two decks up until probably, I'd say, 2 days before the tournament. But then my friend Brandon Meesmer, he's a local player in the Myrtle Beach, South Carolina area here, and you know, he was asking me, and his brother were asking me to borrow some cards like Captivating Pokepuff and, you know, Team Skullgrunt, and really weird cards. And I knew that they were going to internationals as well. So, you know, I was asking, you know, hey, like, what are you guys playing? Those are some really strange cards to be asking for. And Brandon showed me the deck that they were playing. And, you know, me personally, I like picking weird rogue decks just for a number of reasons. It's always fun to play against something that, or play with something that people are not expecting. It's nice to not have to play against mirror matches, etc. And, you know, looking back at my regional, I guess, runs this year, I've played a lot of decks like that. I've played Jolteon, Glaceon, Garb. I've played Primal Groudon, Mega Scizor, and done pretty well with some of these, I guess, more rogue decks. So when I saw this thing that they were playing, it immediately caught my interest, and I knew I had to test with it. So the deck that they were actually playing is a Quad Wobbuffet deck, and they actually got the idea from Manley. He's the player that came up with this deck, so just want to give a shout out to him as well. But yeah, they were showing me the list, and it immediately caught my attention. It seemed super wacky and weird, and something I don't think anyone had on their radar, which immediately piqued my interest. So that's kind of what made me gravitate towards this deck. And, you know, it was the night actually before regionals. I played a couple games with this, and it just did so good against some of these big decks in the meta. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to play this, and, you know, that's why I went for it. So looking at this deck, the reason I wanted to play it is because against all of the Tier 1 decks, it actually has great matchups. Zoroark, Mega Rayquaza, Vikavolt, Metagross, Decidueye. It has great matchups against all of these decks. Even Espeon Garbodor is a very winnable matchup, surprisingly. But the tier 2 and tier 3 decks is where this deck struggles against. But in my head, I was like, as long as I win my first couple rounds and I'm playing the decks at the top tables, I will do well with this. So that's what made me decide to choose this deck. But let's get into the actual list itself, and I'll show you what this thing looks like. So as you can see in this, it's extremely weird. We are playing absolutely zero energy. We are never going to attack with this deck, and we are only playing 4 Wobbuffet. And we're playing Wobbuffet for its Bide Barricade ability. So it shuts off the abilities for non-psychic Pokemon, and it's only a 1 prize Pokemon, and it has a decent amount of HP. So that's what we're going to kind of use to wall behind while we disrupt our opponent. That's going to be what this deck is all about. It's a mill deck, similar to Sylveon or Wailord and stuff like that. So let's look at the supporters and rest of the trainers, because this is where the deck really gets interesting. So we're playing 4 Team Flare Grunt and 4 Team Skull Grunt. Flare Grunt lets us get rid of an energy on our opponent's active Pokemon, and Skull Grunt lets us get rid of 2 energy in our opponent's hand if they have them. So this is going to be the main way we're going to strip our opponent of their resources and energy, and eventually, hopefully our opponent runs out of steam and we can just finish milling them with something like a Team Rocket's Handiwork, which we play 4 of. We flip 2 coins for each heads. We discard the top 2 cards of our opponent's deck. So we can, like I said, help mill our opponent and just speed up the process of them decking out. Next up we play 4 Lysander, which probably seems really odd. Most decks only play about 2, but there's going to be a lot of times we are going to try to Lysander stall our opponent and bring up Pokemon that have big retreat costs or might not be able to attack us. So we're going to play 4 of those just to ensure that we always have an out to that. We're playing 4 Skyla, which is another insanely heavy count of a card we typically only see as like a 1 of in most decks. But this is good because if we have a Puzzle of Time, which is actually missing from the graphic you guys are seeing, I do apologize about that. We are playing 4 Puzzle of Time in this list. But if we already have one of them in hand, we can just Skyla and grab our other one. That way we can use its effect to get 2 cards from our discard pile back into our hand. But it's also good because if we don't have another good supporter for next turn, we can Skyla and just grab another supporter. And it also lets us get around things like Garbodor. That's going to be very important. So ideally, we don't really want to play many items in the early game against Garbodor. So instead of doing that, we can, let's say we have a handful of items. We can always Skyla for, something like an N or something like that, which is also not in this list. I do apologize. I was in a hurry to put this tournament report together, but this deck does play 4N as well. So we can do that to grab ourselves an N. Or just like I said, any other trainer card that we want. And the last of the supporters is going to be 3 Bridget. So we get to search our deck for 1 basic EX and put it on our bench, or 3 non-EX basics and put them on our bench. So ideally we want to use this to get our other 3 Wobbuffets to ensure that we have a full bench, because this deck actually does have a problem with getting benched out. That is a problem I actually ran into during my tournament as well, which I'll get to in just a little bit. So we're playing 3 Bridges to ensure that we can fill our bench up pretty quickly. Then 4 Verse Seeker, just to reuse all of those different supporters we just mentioned. 4 Trainer's Mail, look at the top 4 cards of our deck, get a trainer card we find there. So unlike Sylveon, we don't have a way to search out what we want. So Trainer's Mail is a nice card. It lets us dig a little deeper and potentially grab something that we might want to use. 4 Crushing Hammer, flip a coin if heads, discard an energy from one of your opponent's Pokemon. So again, we're trying to strip our opponent of their resources. Crushing Hammer is just another way to do that. 4 Enhanced Hammer, which might seem like a large count, which it is, but one reason we're playing such a thick count of this is because, like I just mentioned, unlike Sylveon, we don't have a way to search out exactly what we need, so we really need to thicken up our counts of cards that we want to run into, just to ensure that we have a better chance of drawing them. But with Enhanced Hammer, we can discard a special energy from one of our opponent's Pokemon, so mainly to get rid of things like double colorless energy. That's going to be the main one. Next up, 4 Captivating Pokepuff, which is a card we very rarely ever see, but it definitely has a lot of synergy in this deck because we get to look at our opponent's hand and put any amount of basic Pokemon we find there onto their bench. So a common thing people like to do against this deck, they try to hold on to their non-essential Pokemon and just kind of power up one or two Pokemon that way you can't Lysander stall. But with Pokepuff, we can look at their hand and put a, maybe a Shaman or a Lele or maybe a Pokemon that's just not good against us on their bench, and then we can Lysander it up. Another nice use of captivating Pokepuff is we can look at our opponent's hand, and if they have energy, we can actually use Team Skull Grunt. That way we don't have to commit to using Skull Grunt if we aren't sure if we're even going to get an effect from it. So definitely a very good card. I can't count how many Leles and Shamans that I ended up forcing onto my opponent's field throughout the course of this tournament, thanks to this card. Next up, 3 Field Blower. So you get discard up to 2 stadiums or tools in play. So this is cool because we can get rid of, most importantly, our opponent's float stones, so we can Lysander stall them. And we don't play any stadiums of our own, so it allows us to get rid of our opponent's stadiums and make sure that those get discarded. And then the last of the trainer cards is going to be 2 Rescue Stretcher. So it lets us put 3 Pokemon from our discard into our deck, or we can get a Pokemon from our discard and put it into our hand. So we have 4 Wobbuffet, and with 2 Rescue Stretcher, that is 6 prizes basically that our opponent has to take. So yeah, guys, that is going to be the list we are trying out here, and yeah, that's pretty much it. There are a couple cards that I did want to fit in here, and I'll go over those, I think, probably after I go through my matchups. But this is actually, I believe, Grant Manley's exact list that he was playing with. Not at this tournament, but the one he tipped my friend off to. And so that's the one I ended up settling on using. And so let's go into my matchups and show how I did at this tournament. Okay, so day 1 of Swiss, there was going to be 9 rounds. And so that means I need to go either 7-2 at this tournament or 6-1-2 with very good resistance in order to get into day 2 and secure my Worlds invite. So definitely a little bit of pressure there, but it's definitely doable. But first round, I get paired up against Drampa Garbodor, which I'm actually a little bit excited for. This is the Garbodor variant I would much prefer to play against. Espeon is a little bit harder of a Pokemon to deal with, but Drampa has a bigger retreat cost, and it's just kind of an awkward Pokemon to attack against Wobbuffet with. So game 1, I actually got benched out. I only had 1 Wobbuffet. My opponent, just kind of benched me out, like I said, which is unfortunate, but the good thing about it is that I didn't reveal too many cards in my deck, so my opponent still didn't have a good idea of what he was actually playing against. Game 2, unfortunately, my deck was just working kind of awkwardly. My opponent had a good response to basically everything that I did. Whenever I try to Lysander stall, he would Ninja Boy into something with a lower retreat cost in order to get out of the active spot. I was flipping tails on some cards. And overall, my deck just wasn't functioning that well, and my opponent ended up winning that one as well. So starting off the day with a loss is not something I wanted because, like I mentioned earlier, most of the Tier 1 decks, this deck has a solid matchup against. But if I lose my first couple rounds and I'm playing against these decks at the bottom tables, like the Tier 2 and Tier 3 decks, I'm not going to have a good tournament, so I did not want to take a loss this early on in the tournament. But next up, I play against a Water Toolbox type of deck, and I think the girl I was playing against was maybe a more casual player because she didn't have Max Elixirs or, some of the more common staple cards that we're used to seeing. Ended up winning this one as well. I won our first game, and game 2 did not complete, but it actually was a little bit nerve-wracking because she played a lot of energy. I think it was like 14 or 15, and played things like energy retrieval as well, which actually made, keeping her energy off of her Pokemon very difficult to do, but I did end up winning that one. Next up for round 3, I get paired against my friend Will Beers, and I was so bummed because I knew what he was playing. He was playing Espeon Garbodor, and it is a winnable matchup, but it is not something I want to play against, really. It's just not. It definitely is a sketchy matchup for sure. Every game I've ever played against it has been extremely close and nerve-wracking. So game 1, my deck just kind of did its thing. I was Lysander stalling, stripping my opponent's energy, used Team Rocket's handiwork to discard the resources, and it was extremely close, but I did pull out a game 1. And the one thing this deck does have going for it is you can very frequently steal the first game in a series because people just aren't used to playing against it, and they don't have the best strategy worked out right away. So that is going to be actually how this deck stands a chance against Espeon. But next round, my deck just was not working quite as well, and Will was able to beat me here. So we go into game 3, and I actually got very fortunate. He started with a Drampa GX, and that is one of my favorite Pokemon to see, just because it is very hard for it to actually take a knockout on a Garbodor. Since he does not play Team Magma Base in his deck, that means Drampa is going to have to two-shot my Wobbuffet if he does keep it in the active spot. But turn 1, I Skull Grunt away 2 double colorless energies, which was huge. And then also, I believe on my second turn, I Team Rocket's handiworked another DCE. So just right off the bat, I was in a very dominant position. But unfortunately, about halfway through the game, time got called. And so that means we were not going to be able to complete it. But very luckily, I think Will saw that I was in a very strong position, and Will knew that I needed to day 2 this event in order to get my invite, and he was very gentlemanly like and just scooped to me. So definitely super appreciative of Will, for giving me that third game there. So yeah, I got a little bit lucky there, but nevertheless, I was playing against Espeon, and it was still winnable, and I think that's a common misconception people have with this deck. But anyways, so going on to my next round, I get paired against a Mega Rayquaza deck, and I am ecstatic. Mega Rayquaza is definitely one of the best matchups for this deck, just because there's plenty of Lysander stall targets. They only play maybe about 8 energy total in their deck, so it's very easy to run Mega Rayquaza out of resources. So game 1, my deck just kind of did what it's supposed to. I was Lysander stalling, milling my opponent, and took game 1 very convincingly. The second game was going okay, but I remember I hit double tails on 2 Team Rocket's handiworks and foot tails on some crushing hammers, and it was enough to allow my opponent to inch back into the game, and he actually benched me out at one point. And I was actually really disappointed because a good amount of time in the round had gone by. Going into round 3, or game 3 of the series, my deck was working how it's supposed to. I was Lysander stalling, just doing all the stuff that you would expect to see in this matchup, but time got called, and unfortunately the game did not finish, which means for the round it was a tie. And I was, it's not the end of the world. I can still win out and make day 2, but it just hurt a lot to have such a favorable matchup end in a tie, knowing that it was going to result in a win, had time not been a factor. So I was a little bit bummed about that. But nevertheless, like I said, staying optimistic, I can still win out and make day 2. But next round I get paired against another Espeon Garbodor deck. And at this point, I was just super frustrated. I was like, where's all the Zoroark decks? Where's the Vikavolt, the Decidueyes? All of the stuff that I have a great matchup against. So luckily, I forget exactly how this series went, but I think I actually 2-0'd my opponent. I think he just didn't know how to play against the matchup, like I said, and that allowed me an out in order to win. I think both games were very close. Like I said earlier, Espeon Garb is a very close matchup, but I ended up winning that series. So I'm feeling pretty good. I've taken down 2 Espeon Garb decks, and I'm thinking, cool, I should be hitting a different deck soon. Well, I was wrong. Next round, I get paired against another Espeon Garbodor deck. And this one was a little bit sketchier. I did win my first game. It kind of worked like how it was supposed to. But next round, my opponent adapted extremely well and took game 2 much more convincingly. And then going into game 3, it started out very well for me, but again, my opponent was playing just super well. And the game actually did go to time. And if my opponent would have had one more turn, he actually would have won and taken the whole series. But luckily for me, it did go to time, and the series resulted in a tie. So I'm thinking this has got to be the end of my Espeon Garbodor decks I'm going to run against. But luckily, next round, I did not play against Espeon Garb. I played against a Vespiquen deck. I'm actually very happy because right now at this point I have 1 loss and 2 ties, and I can actually still make day 2, but I have to win out, and my resistance has to be decent. My opponents have to be winning their games as well. But I get paired against a Vespiquen, and I actually knew the player, Jake Maxwell, I believe it's his last name. But This is actually a closer matchup than you think, but I was able to strand an Oranguru in the active spot, and my opponent prized his last floatstone, so I was able to just mill him very easily, and I don't think he took a single prize that game, but our game 2 was much closer. And, I had a couple of bad flips go my way, and, things like that, and my opponent was actually doing a great job of not being Lysander stalled and keeping their energy in their deck. And he actually got within one prize of winning, but I milled the last energy that he had, and he was not able to seal up the game, so I beat Vespiquen, and feeling good. I just have to win 2 more, and I have, I'm going on to day 2, most likely, assuming my opponent's resistance is good. So next up I get paired against Decidueye, and I am just beyond thrilled. This is the definition of an auto win for this deck. So Bide Barricade shuts off Decidueye's Feather Arrow ability, also shuts off Vileplume if they choose to play something like that as well. But yeah, so Decidueye actually takes 3 energy to do 90 to a Wobbuffet. So once it gets that energy, if it can, it doesn't even knock out one Wobbuffet. So you can usually almost always strip your opponent's energy before they get set up, and even if they use Hollow Hunt GX to get their energy back into their hand, you can always just Skull Grunt it away. So I won this very convincingly, 2-0, my opponent didn't take a single prize. So I was feeling pretty good. I was like, this is how my day is supposed to go. I just have to win 1 more. Maybe I can play against a Vikavolt or a Drampa, Zoroark, or one of these other decks I keep mentioning. And so me and my last round opponent are shuffling up, and I see a Silent Lab in his deck, and so my heart sinks, because that is telling me I am playing against Greninja Break. And Greninja, unfortunately, is as close to an auto loss as this deck can get. So I'm just beyond disappointed, because this means I'm probably not going to win this matchup. And both games, as expected, were not that close. My opponent won pretty convincingly. But the reason it's so bad is because your opponent plays Silent Lab, so they can shut off your Wobbuffet's ability and allow them to use their own abilities yet again. They have Talonflame, so if you strip a lot of their resources away, they can always just use Aeroblitz to draw out of their dead hand that they have. Talonflame has 0 retreat cost, Greninja has 0 retreat cost, so you can never Lysander stall anything. And my opponent played 1 Fisherman and 2 Super Odds to always get back the energy that they needed. So again, I would say this is as close to an unwinnable matchup as you can get. The only time you can get lucky is if your opponent is playing the Starmie version that doesn't run Fisherman and doesn't run Silent Labs. So that version is much more doable, but unfortunately I was not lucky enough to get paired against that version. And I was so bummed because I remember looking around at my table, I saw Decidueye decks, Mega Rayquaza, Zoroark, all these decks I had good matchups against. And my opponent, I think he kind of realized the predicament I was in, and he was very apologetic. He felt bad, I could tell. But that's just how it goes, you can't control who you get paired up against. So unfortunately for the day, I finish 5-2-2, which means I'm not going to advance on to day 2 to get my Worlds invite. But nevertheless, I definitely had a very solid run with this deck. It was fun to play, if nothing else, and it feels good to do decent with one of these rogue decks. I still got some championship points. It wasn't enough to get my Worlds invite, but it's something at least. So yeah, that was kind of how my day went. Luckily, there was a lot of good food in Indianapolis that I got to eat to drown my sorrows away with. But yeah, overall though, super good weekend. Got to see a lot of friends that I don't get to see normally. And I guess any regrets as far as the weekend goes, I don't regret playing this deck, but the one card I really wanted to find space in, that I was kind of alluding to earlier, was Team Aqua's Secret Base. Because it's a Stadium card and it gives 1 more retreat cost to your opponent's non-Team Aqua Pokemon. So there were so many times during my day where my opponent had just enough energy to retreat and a Team Aqua base would have stranded them otherwise. And this actually makes the Greninja matchup a lot more manageable, because if you're able to captivating Pokepuff something like a Froakie onto their bench and you Lysander it up, the Froakie suddenly has 2 retreat, which means that they can't as easily get out of the active spot. But unfortunately, I started testing with this deck the night before the tournament, so I just didn't have enough time to really iron out any changes I wanted to make to this list. So, But the list I settled on, I think, was still solid. Like I said, big thanks to Brandon Meessemer and Corey Meessemer for tipping me off to this deck, and a big thanks to Grant Manley for being the one who came up with this this very trolly deck. But but yeah, guys, that's pretty much my regional report. I can't think of too much else to go over. I might do a PTCGO video with this soon just to show you how this looks in action. But yeah, definitely let me know in the comments what you think of this idea. Would love to hear your feedback. But as usual, guys, feel free to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out our merchandise over at rarecandytcg.com. If you can pick up something to help support the channel, it'd mean a lot to us. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you for the next one.